look at conditions of life in occupied territories, embargoes of food and medicine, of internment, long-term displacement. I would look at violent disappearances, killings in times of peace. And then finally, only finally, we would look at military attack, very specific attacks on civilian populations. Okay. But having outlined this, I think that the striking similarity with Sri Lanka is in fact with the Nazis. And having said that, I just want to emphasize that the Holocaust was on an entirely different scale. There were 6 million Jewish people who died, and millions of people from other ethnicities, the Gypsies, for example. But if we set aside the issue of scale and look at the methods, we will see a lot of similarities. We will see structural similarities, and that's what I want to focus on. So in that sense, I just want to emphasize, I'm talking about the similarities with pre-1943, the Sri Lankan state, compared to pre-1943, the Nazi state. Okay, and I say pre-1943 because the Nazi state accelerated in its final years towards Holocaust. That's not how it started. I mean, the Nazis came to power in 1932 via elections, and their policies, their ethnic policies, were formulated much earlier. So if we look at the similarities, we would say that in the Nazis' case, there was existing anti-Semitic prejudice in Europe from the Middle Ages onwards, that the Nazis built their philosophy, their race theory on this. And we would say that there exists an equivalent philosophical basis in Sri Lanka, which is the Mahavansa. And the Mahavansa, which includes concepts such as the Sinhalese are the rightful people of Sri Lanka. It explicitly equates 1,000 Tamil lives as worth less than one Sinhala life. And today there is a militant Buddhist clergy with a political party that propagates these theories. Okay. So, in 2003, the Buddhist monks made a decree that Sinhala Deshiya, the country of the Sinhalese, is an indivisible unitary state where ethnic, linguistic, or religious differences must be erased. And this echoes, of course, other racist groups such as the Nazis, right? Then we look at, for example, similarities via legislation. How did the whole thing begin? And you have the Nuremberg laws, which the Nazis came about with to strip the Jewish people of citizenship and to effectively to reduce their participation in public life, especially in law, for example, in government jobs, and so forth. And of course, the Sri Lankan Citizenship Act stripped 1 million Indian Tamils of citizenship, also on the basis of their parentage, of whether their parents were born in Sri Lanka or their grandparents were born in Sri Lanka, which they knew that the act was devised essentially in such a way that certain ethnic groups could not be citizens because they migrated from South India to Sri Lanka, and they wouldn't meet the criterion easily. So that was part of the Citizenship Act. And then subsequently, we would look, for example, the Nazis did much less of this, the pogroms. There was Kristallnacht, for example. There was much less mass, sort of random outbursts of mass killing. But of course, Sri Lanka has pogroms, has a series of pogroms. And after the civil war started, you would say that in some form, the killing was more systematic because you have, people, there are instances where civilian populations are funneled into small areas to achieve economies of scale in killing. So you could say that refugees are asked to go into a church and then the church is bombed, or they can go into a school and then the school is bombed. So you would see this as quite a deliberate technique of compressing people in a small area and then being able to bomb them. And we've seen this in 1995, and of course we saw it in 2009. We also have, of course, village massacres by soldiers and so forth. Right now, other similarities might be the destruction. Nazis specifically went out and targeted Jewish libraries and books. Jaffna Library was targeted. Places of worship have been targeted, and so forth. Okay, but perhaps more interestingly, also, you would look at similarities, what you call decapitation, where you look at a target population and you try to destroy its leadership. And that kind of goes, it's a common sense approach to any organism, where you look at the organism, and for the organism or the group as a whole to function, it needs leadership, it needs some form of coordination. So it's not just attacking the press, but you also, of course, destroy the leadership, and the leadership tends to be intellectual leadership. So in that you see assassinations effectively on the student bodies will be under threat, politicians, civil society leaders, anyone who organizes any form of civil resistance would be a target. And that's what we see in Sri Lanka. So it's not just aid workers, it's not just media workers, but it's also civil society leaders, students, academics, anyone who's politically active would have been a prime target. This was in the ceasefire period, for example, or in fact, overall periods of occupation of Jaffna and the North. Right? Other aspects, there are very many aspects. I mean, one thing you could look, of course, is the similarity between what Germany was trying to achieve in Eastern Europe, its movements of peoples into specified locations, this concept of living room, living space, Lebensraum, in Poland, which meant that they literally wanted to move Germans from other parts of the world, of Europe into specific areas of Poland, and the Jewish people were forced to evacuate and were in fact herded into the Warsaw Ghetto. And there I would look at the similarities with what happens in Lavani, in the sense that Lavani has been emptied of people. And the people of Lavani were forced to go to a safe zone, and then they were forced into the concentration camps. Right? So those similarities are striking. That, as I said, there is not an issue of scale, it's an issue of method, of approach. Disappearances, of course, and then physical existence, threats to physical existence, starvation rationing, for example. There have been continuous embargoes on Jaffna, on the north, throughout the 90s. The A9 was only opened up during the ceasefire talks. And of course, we saw the same food issues arising again in the Vani in the final years, in 2008, 2009, especially towards the end, where there was the continuous issue of blockades, medicine and food. Right. So ghettoization, starvation, effectively destruction of the conditions of creating conditions of life calculated to bring about the destruction of the group. And that is how we would base our case. I'm going to stop at this point, and then I'm going to move from the long term, the timeline and the long-term methods, the structural case, to 2009 specifically. And then in the third part, I will just talk about India's role and responsibilities.